Hello students, welcome to our online video tutorial class. So you students have seen already, I have sent you the entire syllabus of class 11. There are actually 22 chapters are there. It is subdivided into 5 different units. So we are starting with the first chapter only of our syllabus, that is the living world. In this chapter actually we will be discussing various type of points like that. First of all, the definition of the living we will be discussing. Second, we will be discussing about the definition of the life, then characteristics of the living, then metabolism, biodiversity, need for classification, 3 domain concept, taxonomy definition, steps of taxonomy classification, taxon and taxonomy categories, organisms with their taxonomy categories, importance of taxonomy, definition of systematics, importance of systematics, relationship between taxonomy and systematics, taxonomic hierarchy, nomenclature system, nomenclature types, rules of binomial nomenclature, taxonomic aids, and definition and characteristic features of the species. So these are the points are actually present in this chapter. So one by one specific point we will be discussing in this chapter. Okay, so let's start. First of all, there is a first point is given, what is living. We all know that the living is such kind of the procedure by which the organisms, specifically the living organisms, are surviving. So living is actually the mechanism of survival. So living things or the living substances means which specific organisms can move, which organisms can grow, which organisms can change their physiological features according to the environmental condition, which organisms even can reproduce. So if these features are common in some organisms, so obviously those organisms are commonly known as living things or living organisms. So always keep it in your mind, these living organisms are always need air, water, food and shelter for their survival. Second thing is that people, animal, plants, they are all living things. So these are the examples of the living things, you can consider this. After the living things, next point we have to study, that is what is life. Life is actually the accumulation of various physiological processes by which the organisms can survive. So living is actually the condition, the process, and life is actually the accumulation of all of physiological processes by which they can survive. So this is actually there is a very minute difference in between living and life, but there is a difference present. Okay, so let's see what is life. It is written, the living things need to take energy, living things get rid of waste, living things grow and develop, as well as living things respond to their environment, and living things reproduce and pass their traits on their offspring, and over time living things evolve, change slowly in response to their environment. That means these all physiological processes, that means to take energy, waste releasing process, growing and developing process, responding to the environment, that process, reproductive process, as well as evolutionary process. These all processes, when you are just accumulating them, when you are assembling them, that means actually the life. So life is there in the living thing, that's why the organisms can survive. If the life is not there, if this accumulation of these processes are not present, then obviously that organism can't survive. Okay, moving to the next slide. Here we will be discussing about need for classification. That means why the classification of the organisms are very much needed to us. There are a few reasons, whatever I have just jotted down here. First thing is that to categorize the organisms, whatever the organisms are present throughout the world, those organisms has to be categorized in small groups or small categories. Otherwise it's not possible to study about them. So obviously classification is needed for that. Second point is given to study about their scientific identifying features. So obviously when any organism is properly grouped, properly classified into any category, obviously it is easier it will be easier for studying about their identifying features. So obviously identifying features will be a important thing for knowing any specific organism surviving in this world. So classification is needed. To give names or nomenclature, obviously when we are identifying any organism or when we are classifying, obviously the naming of the organism, scientific name as well as common name, this giving is very much required. So for that reason classification is very much important for giving the names to the each and every organism irrespective of animals and plants. to study the relationship between organisms. That means whatever the organisms are present in this world, those organisms are interrelated with each other by several means or based on several factors. So that relationship study is very much required for knowing about any organism as well as the relation with other organisms. So for that case, classification is one and only procedure which can help us for relating various organisms. Okay, and if the classification is also known to us, it will help us to trace about the evolutionary pathway of any specific organismic development. So classification has also one more utility to trace the evolutionary process. Now we are moving for the next thing, that is characteristics of living. That means whatever the basic characteristics should be there for any kind of living things or which organisms should have life. Let's see, these are the characteristic features. First one you can see, that is a cellular organization. Obviously any living organism should have cellular organization. Without cellular organization, obviously we can't think about any living organism. Maybe that cell is prokaryotic, that organism is prokaryotic or eukaryotic, but cellular organization, protoplasmic organization with cell organelle should be there. Second, reproduction. Reproduction is another more important feature which is proving any organism is living or non-living. Obviously when any organism is giving birth to the next generation offspring, obviously that proves that organism is living. Now we know from the lower classes that reproduction can be of various types, like that asexual, sexual and vegetative type. So that is actually varying organism to organism, but reproduction is the basic feature for any kind of living organism. Third, metabolism. Metabolism is such kind of process by which we are breaking down our food materials and from there we are getting the energy, and by utilizing that energy we are performing various kind of physiological processes. So obviously metabolism is another basic characteristic feature for any kind of living object. Homeostasis. Homeostasis is a such kind of process for by which we are maintaining our body balance. Whatever the physiological systems are going on in our body, those specific systems has to be maintained in a proper balance. Balance has to be maintained. Otherwise, the organisms can't survive properly. Organisms will be getting sick. So homeostasis is the next characteristic feature which should be there in each and every living being for their survival. Heredity. Obviously, heredity should be another feature, because when any living being is performing reproduction, obviously their target is to transmit the genetic characteristic feature or genetic makeup to the next generation. So if heredity or inheritance is not there, obviously it's not possible for any of the organism to survive generation after generation. So heredity will be the another basic feature for any kind of living being. Response to the stimuli. Response to the stimuli is the next feature. When any kind of stimulus is given to any living organism, obviously that organism has to give some response to prove that that organism is living. If any organism or if any substance is not giving the response against any stimuli, that means that organism is not living, or that organism is non-living, or that object is non-living. So giving response to the stimuli, that is another very important basic feature for any kind of living being. Growth and development. Growth and development, these two terms we are using almost in a synonymous manner, but there is a little bit difference in between these two terms, and these two terms or these two features are also found in case of living objects. Growth means when any specific organism or when any specific cell is increasing in its size or volume or quantity, then it will be considered as a growth. But what is development? Development means when any specific organism is updating or upgrading its any physiological system step by step in an evolutionary way, then that specific process is commonly known as development. As an example, suppose from the zygote when any specific organism is taking birth, or the embryo is forming, or the fetus is forming, obviously size of the each and every cells, it is actually growing, so that will be considered as growth. But with that, various kind of physiological system, various kind of organs, tissues, these things are actually coming in the embryo structure, so that will be considered as development. That will not be growth. Growth means only increasing size, shape, volume and these things. Clear to everyone? Adaptation through evolution. Obviously our target, or any living organism's target, is to adapt with environmental condition, and for that reason we are creating various kind of new features, new variations to adapt with the environmental condition. So evolution is always an ongoing process. It is actually it is a such kind of process which will be not getting finished anytime up to the existence of the earth, and up to that time, up to the existence of the earth, or all organisms who will be surviving in this world, they will always try to adapt with the changing environmental condition. So this will be the last characteristic feature which is very much important. So these specific features are the basic features what we have to write when it will be asked that write down the basic features of the living things. Going for the next, first thing is that metabolism. What is metabolism? Already I have told you, metabolism is such kind of process by which we are breaking down any complex food substance into simpler. Let's see biochemical reactions within a living organism which are necessary to maintain the life. So several kind of reactions which are actually happening inside our body, and those reactions are all biochemical reactions. So these biochemical reactions, when the accumulation of those biochemical reactions which are actually helping any organism to survive, and that is necessary for maintaining the life, that is commonly known as metabolism. Here we can see actually the types of metabolism. Rather, actually there are two types of the metabolism. One is catabolism, one is anabolism. Okay. Catabolism is such kind of the process. In the left hand side you can see here, catabolic reaction is such kind of the reaction which transfers energy from complex molecule to ATP. That means catabolic reaction is such kind of the reaction where any specific complex food substance will be getting broken down into smaller pieces. That is actually the catabolic reaction. Okay, and when the breakdown is happening, on that time this heat is getting released. This heat is released during the breakdown process. Okay. Now, after catabolic process, obviously simple molecules like glucose, amino acid, glycerol and fatty acid, these things are coming, because when macrobiomolecules are broken down, macrobiomolecules means I am talking about polysaccharide, I am talking about protein, lipid, these things when they are broken down, obviously they will be forming glucose, amino acid, glycerol and all these things. So breakdown process is always the catabolic process. So these things are actually forming. Now, when these specific simpler molecules are again getting assembled and forming the complex compound from where it has produced, that specific reaction is commonly known as anabolic process. Clear? So that specific process where simpler molecule are again getting converted to the complex one, that will be considered as anabolic process. And in this process you can see that ATP is generally actually utilized here. Okay, so there also heat is getting released, and from there the complex molecules like polymers, like that glycogen, protein, triglyceride means one kind of fat. So these things are actually getting produced. One thing always keep it in your mind, this is a breakdown process, this is a constructive process. Catabolic reaction, energy or heat is released, here also heat is released, but the thing is that here the ADP is getting converted to ATP. That means ATP is getting synthesized in the catabolic reaction, but in the anabolic reaction ATP is broken down. Okay, catabolic reaction, complex food substances are getting converted into simpler, and here simpler food substance is getting converted to the complex. Okay, so actually our metabolic process or our metabolism is actually the accumulation of the catabolism and anabolism both. Okay, so both of the processes are happening in our body. Here actually the difference is given. It is a building up process, it is a breakdown process, we already know. Smaller molecules are getting accumulated and forming the larger molecules and the complex molecules. Catabolism, larger molecules are broken down into smaller subunits or smaller molecules. Chemical energy is formed and stored. Here the stored chemical energy is released and used. Here the example, what is that? Synthesis of the protein from amino acid to protein synthesis, that is anabolism. And here breaking down of the glucose to CO2 and water, that is the catabolism. Obviously when the respiration is happening, what is happening? Glucose is broken down into CO2 and water. So obviously that will be one kind of catabolic process. So difference I think is very much clear. Another more important thing, always keep it in your mind, in anabolic process, in the previous slide we have seen, ATP will be utilized, and during catabolic process ATP will be synthesized. Keep it in your mind. Catabolic process is mostly exothermic process, anabolic process or anabolic reactions are mostly endothermic process. Clear? So this is getting over. What is biodiversity? Biodiversity is such kind of diversity of the organisms throughout the world. Okay, so that is known as actually biodiversity. Here you can see the actual meaning of the biodiversity. Bio means life, diversity means variety. So throughout the world, whatever the diversity or the variety is present in the organisms, that is commonly known as biodiversity. Here the definition is very much clear to everyone. The number and the variety of the plant and animals and other organisms that exist in an ecosystem is known as biodiversity. It is a measure for the variety of organisms present in the different ecosystems. The richness of the biodiversity depends on the climatic condition and area of the region. Obviously, in which specific region the biodiversity is existing, that is the question. Because if that region is so much favorable for the organisms, obviously the biodiversity will be more. But in case of which environment the environmental condition or that geographical area is not suitable for those organisms, obviously the biodiversity will not so much. Okay, it will be limited. Biodiversity is a result of the 3.5 billion years of evolution. So continuously throughout last 3.5 billion years this evolutionary process is happening, and biodiversity is only the result of that. Okay, so this is actually the definition of the biodiversity which is actually given in this slide. Moving to the various levels of biodiversity, we all know that there are various levels of the biodiversity, that is ecological diversity, species diversity and genetic diversity. What is ecological diversity? Ecological diversity is a such kind of the diversity where we can see that first of all, in case of ecological diversity, that means the diversity of various ecosystems, that is commonly known as ecological biodiversity. Okay, so when the various kinds of diversity is present actually in various kinds of ecosystem, that will be known as ecological diversity. Second one, species diversity. What is species diversity? Species diversity is a type of diversity which is actually found in various different species of organisms. And next, what is genetic diversity? Genetic diversity is a such kind of diversity where the organisms belonging from a single species are also different from each other based on their genetic makeup. So this can be called as genetic diversity. So these are the basic things of the ecological diversity, species diversity and genetic diversity. Ecological diversity means diversity among different ecosystems, ecological areas throughout the world. Species diversity is the diversity of the organisms of the organisms present in a single ecosystem. So suppose in a single ecosystem various types of organisms or various species of organisms are there. So whatever the diversity is found, that is the species diversity. And genetic diversity means the diversity among organisms who are actually belonging from same species. So those organisms are actually studied based on their difference in the genetic makeup, and that is commonly known as genetic diversity. So thank you students. Up to this biodiversity we have completed today's video. Next we will be making the next video based on the next points, so wait for that. Thank you.